As the nations of the world are distracted by their own economic problems, two major powers in Europe and Asia are making aggressive incursions into neighboring countries.
The German story is usually understood in the framework of the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, the sense that Germans felt betrayed by peace treaties, that they had to give up so much. The Japanese argument is that Japan itself didn't really have that much land to cultivate. There was not even enough rice to go around, not much minerals, iron, no oil at all. So the argument is that it was justifiable for the country to seek more space, to resettle the surplus population and to obtain iron and coal and oil that the nation needed.
The fact that many nations, including the United States, have become isolationist allows Japan and Germany to annex neighboring countries with minimal interference.
That was the time that Congress passed the first of several neutrality laws. These laws did what Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan had advocated 20 years before. It said that the United States had to stay out of harm's way, that the president should embargo, ban the sale of arms to combatants, that the president should ban lending money to combatants, that Americans shouldn't travel in war zones, because otherwise what had happened in World War I would happen again.
This first Neutrality Act was passed in 1935 after Hitler had come to power. The Italians were on the move. Mussolini was on the move. We're not going to get involved.
Roosevelt, who had been in the Wilson administration, remembered very vividly the problems that the war had created for Woodrow Wilson, and he was determined not to encounter those same problems for himself. Many people criticized him for not moving fast enough and decisively enough, and perhaps he didn't. But his reason was that he wanted to be sure that as we moved into the war, we did it as a nation that could be united behind the war effort.
So it takes the United States almost about the same amount of time to get into World War II as it took it to get into World War I, because people are so insistent that a European war has nothing to do with them, does not threaten their security, and they don't want to needlessly sacrifice American lives.
Alarmed by Germany's territorial advances in Europe, leaders of Britain and France arranged to meet with Hitler in Munich in September of 1938. They agreed to cede him the portion of Czechoslovakia he's already occupied in return for his promise not to expand further. But in the spring of 1939, he moves into the rest of Czechoslovakia and on September 1st launches a full-scale attack on Poland, both direct violations of the Munich Accords. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war on Germany. World War II has begun.
In 1914, August, war broke out in Europe, and Woodrow Wilson asked Americans to remain neutral in thought and action. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, President Roosevelt said, "We have neutrality acts, and we will remain neutral."
This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. I have said not once but many times that I have seen war and that I hate war.
Eventually, Roosevelt was able to persuade Congress to see that there was some sort of threat in Europe from fascism and militarism, and the Japanese in Asia, and that, for example, we would trade with belligerent nations, but they would have to pay cash. We wouldn't give them loans anymore because they still owed us from World War I. And they would have to carry away their trade on their own ships. So American ships wouldn't enter the war zone. And so Roosevelt continually fought and pushed Congress to do more for the democracy.
And in 1938, Congress increased naval spending by 20%. And Congress was generous with military spending for the Air Force, not the Army. When World War II broke out in Europe, our army was 16th or 17th largest in the world. Greece had a larger army than we did. Why? Well, armies get sent to Europe to fight in war, but the Navy and the Air Force will protect the shores.
But from about 1939, the United States does begin to show where it stands, that it begins to condemn Japanese action and begins to express its support for China and begins some small-scale assistance programs. The The first one comes at the very end of 1938 when the United States gives China a loan of $25 million. It's a very small-scale loan. But from 1939, it's clear that the United States is not going to let Japan run all over China. That would be detrimental to American interests and also to the peace in Asia.
Once the British and Free French were driven out of France, Nazis controlled all of Europe. The balance in public opinion began to shift towards greater American engagement in the war, although not yet towards actual intervention. And the tremendous advances in war production, in shipbuilding, airplane building, building of other armaments, some of it to aid the British, some of it to prepare the United States for what many people were coming to assume would be its own inevitable involvement in the war.